Good evening. Thank you for your patience. The delay is entirely my fault, no one else's, but we'll get started. And I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Thanks for coming out to our lecture series tonight. We're going to turn our attention to the environment and the economy in one lecture, I think. And we have our friend and colleague Adele Morris out from Brookings to speak tonight. Some of you may have heard Adele in her previous environmental economic lectures for us. We're thrilled to have her back. She brings a wealth of experience and knowledge on this topic. She's had positions in the federal government from, let's see if I can do this from memory, from the State Department on international energy and treaty issues, from the Treasury Department, from Congress working on, as an economist for the Joint Economic Committee, as well as she has not just a familiarity with international and national issues, but she's gotten to know Nevada well in her time out here, teaching in many classes, working with faculty colleagues like Helen Neal that I see out there in the audience. And she has Western roots of a sort, although her doctorate is from Princeton, she has mathematics degrees from Utah and Rice University. So for those of you who haven't heard her, you're in for a treat. For the note takers in the audience, I need to remind myself to say that thanks to the help of our colleagues here, the lecture will be up on our website in a few days, as will the PowerPoint. So if you miss anything, don't panic or hurt yourself in writing too fast. Adele, it's all yours.
Thanks so much. It's always such a pleasure to come to Las Vegas and to the university. I just always feel like I'm just so lucky to be here because everybody's so nice. And I just got to thank Bill like times 10 because he really is the ringmaster of all these circus acts that come from Washington and come speak to you, and he keeps us organized, and he manages, and he's a mastermind, I think, in all of the Brookings Mountain West. So I'm just delighted to be part of the program and to have this opportunity to come talk to people outside the Beltway. It's always good for the soul. So I'm going to talk about a policy that is part of President Obama's climate action plan. And there have been a whole series of steps leading up to what really is probably the biggest environmental rulemaking of my career. And so this is a very big deal, the policy I'm going to be talking about tonight, and its role in what will be a series of regulatory measures. So over the past couple decades, there have been lots of litigation around whether or not EPA had the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And one of the first steps was to have the Supreme Court uphold what's called the endangerment finding. So EPA made a finding that greenhouse gases pose a dangerous risk to human health and the environment. And so that went through a whole long legal phase. And now President Obama is using that authority to start regulating greenhouse gases. So the Supreme Court has upheld the principle of this regulation, but not necessarily the details and the specific part of the Clean Air Act that EPA is going to be using. But it's useful to think about all of these things in kind of the long step towards what really is the default of climate policy, which is going to be a series of these kinds of rulemakings. EPA issued a rule around greenhouse gases from vehicles, and that resulted in the new fuel economy standards that are going to be rolling out over the coming decades. And EPA issued a proposed rule about new power plants. Now that one hasn't gone final yet, but it's out there. And then just in June, EPA issued a rule for existing power plants. And the reason that's a big deal is because it really is the first rule that would govern stationary sources of emissions of greenhouse gases. So all the big power plants and industrial facilities and oil refineries and everything else emit a big share of our greenhouse gases, and this is the first time we've seen a rule that could one day result in controlling emissions from there. So I'm going to draw on a whole bunch of sources of information. I want to give credit to, they're going to see data from the EPA, some information from the President's Council of Economic Advisors that issued some elaborations of the rule. I'm going to draw from some work by scholars at Stanford. You're going to see data from the Energy Information Administration, et cetera. And I'm trying to pull from a whole bunch of sources. So this chart is a chart, kind of a pie chart of where all our CO2 emissions come from. And about a third of our greenhouse gases come from the electric power sector. So any regulation that affects a third of US greenhouse gas emissions right there is a big deal. Now there's a bunch of different gases, and this relates to all of those gases, but you can see even if you're just looking at CO2, it's still a large share of our overall total. EPA's used in its proposed rule a section called 111D. And what that section in the Clean Air Act does is it's kind of a catch-all. It's for regulating stuff that's not toxic. It's not a smog-producing pollutant that would already be regulated under national ambient air quality standards. It's kind of for things that didn't fit. So when Congress wrote the bill, they thought, well, there might be pollutants we haven't thought of yet. But EPA has hardly ever used this authority because up till now, other pollutants fell fairly nicely in those other categories. So there's no case law jurisprudence to govern or to guide what EPA is going to be doing. So this is really innovative rulemaking. And it's of the rules that the agencies issued under this part of the statute, all of them were real small potatoes compared to this. This is economically extremely significant. And so the way this process is going to work, so EPA issued a proposed rule, then the final rule the President has said will come out next summer, a year from when the proposed rule came out. But before that happens, they have to finalize the new source rule. This is for rules that would govern any new power plants. They have to finalize that, and then they can finalize this rule for existing power plants. So let's just suppose the finalization happens just the way we wanted, or the way the administration has mapped out. Then states have to do compliance plans, and there's a whole process by which that happens I'm going to talk about. So in this rulemaking process, EPA sets a standard that it calls the best system of emissions reductions. This is kind of a term of art that comes from the statute. And by best system of emissions reductions, it's the standard that EPA thinks is feasible based on a whole bunch of considerations. So EPA sets this guideline that reflects its calculations, and then states have to figure out how to implement it. So it's kind of one of these deals where EPA sets a standard and then it all falls in the lap of the states, and they're given virtually no restriction on what kind of policy they can implement to achieve the standard. So every state right now is going through this proposed rule and trying to figure out, okay, now what we do. Is this feasible? What are we going to have to do? What policies should we adopt, and so on. So, well, where are these emissions coming from? So this is the electricity emissions from in the US. Now this first pie chart is generation. So this is megawatt hours. and where they come from different fuels. So you can see that coal is 39% of that generating capacity. Natural gas is 27%. So coal is the biggest source of energy for electricity. And then the rest, nuclear is still a big chunk, and we've got hydropower and renewables that aren't hydro. And this little slice here is stuff like petroleum and other fuels. We've used very, very little petroleum in generating electricity. And you can see this in the other measure, which is where does the carbon dioxide come from? And you can see 3/4 of it comes from the coal. So when you hear that expression, the Obama administration is starting a war on coal. Have you heard that term? Okay, so where that claim comes from is that if you're going to do anything about CO2 emissions, particularly from electricity, you really are trying to wring coal out of that system, okay? So whether it's a war or not is kind of in the eye of the beholder, but that's where the emissions are coming from, okay? And then natural gas is only 1/4. So why the disparity? Well, that's because natural gas has about half the carbon per unit of energy than coal. So if you switch from coal to natural gas for the same megawatt hours, you're going to get about half the CO2 emissions. So now let's take a look at Nevada. Now Nevada is a little different than the national. I've shown you the national totals. So this is all of the CO2 emissions from Nevada over time. And so it includes some projections out here. So what happened in Nevada is Nevada in the 1990s used to be very coal intensive. That's that black wedge. And then you see how natural gas from electricity starts coming in here, and then you just see the coal plummet. And that two things are going on there. There's the deployment of renewables, which are substituting from coal. There's the deployment of more natural gas, and you're seeing the recession in part of that because there's just less demand for energy. Because you see how it declines in a lot of those other energy sources as well. Now the projection without the EPA rule is that, you know, that shift from coal to natural gas pretty much stabilizes, and you leave the coal where it was and the natural gas where it was. And then if you need additional generation capacity, the inference from this would be that you get it from renewables because it wouldn't show up on the projections. Okay. Now, within another way to look at this is to look at the generation, and you can see how much of the generation in Nevada is natural gas. So Nevada is disproportionately natural gas compared to other states, but there still is some coal-fired power in there. And of the renewables, the big ones, as you probably guess, would be geothermal and solar. And I think those are the main ones. There's a little bit of biomass co-firing in the coal plants as well. And that would be counted as renewable. Although there's some debate about whether the forest woods that are put in the biomass co-firing are truly sustainable or not. But technically, I think they do come under renewables. So anyway, so the way this rule is going to work is states, so let's just suppose that it goes final in June, like they say. Then the states have to do their compliance plans, and they have to tell EPA a bunch of things about what their plans are. And then they have to submit that to EPA, and EPA has to review it. And if EPA didn't like it, they kick it back to the states and make them do it over and make changes. And then you can get an extension, like you have a couple years to do your plan, and you can get an extension if you want to do a regional compliance plan and set up a policy that states do joint efforts. And then finally in 2020, the hammer comes down and you have to start implementing your compliance plan. That's the idea. So according to EPA, the whole point, we're reducing power plant emissions, like I said. The ultimate goal, now I'm going to tell you there's a little bit of a difference. I'm going to talk about the goals in terms of the level of decline, like how many emissions you start with and how many you're going to end up with. But that's not actually how the rule is written. I'll explain that in a second. But EPA estimates that the rule, if implemented as it was proposed, would reduce CO2 from the power sector by about 30% relative to the levels in 2005. So, and then starting with the biggest reductions in 2020 when the plans start taking effect. And then in addition, EPA says, well, look, if states are moving from coal to natural gas or to renewables, there's this whole other set of benefits. It's not just all about the climate, because coal-fired power generation produces SO2, particulate matter, mercury, nitrogen oxides, and all of those have human health and ecological implications. And so there's going to be all these other benefits, and I'll talk about those in a second. And then they try to aggregate the benefits both for climate and for health. And I'm going to dig into those numbers in a little bit. So they're talking about fairly major reductions in soot and smog. Now, why would that be? Because we already have acid rain rules, and we already have regulations around particulate matter and stuff like that. Why would you expect any benefits? Well, this will go beyond the benefits from those other regulations, because even under those other rules, you're allowed to emit a certain amount of these unhealthy air pollutants. And if you switch from coal to natural gas, you're getting rid of almost all of that. So there are indeed, I think, going to be co-benefits from those other pollutants. Now, here's the trick. Okay, this is not from EPA. This is some work that a colleague at Harvard has done, and kind of elucidating some of the issues of one of my coworkers at Brookings has brought up. And there's sort of two dimensions of the benefits. There's climate, and then there's health, and then there's domestic, and there's global, right? So normally when we have a federal rulemaking, normally what an agency does is describe the costs and benefits within the United States. Well, EPA didn't do that. They did the costs within the United States, but for the climate benefits, they did the global benefits of reducing CO2. And some people have called them out on that and said, what are you doing? What do we care what the climate benefits are outside the US? Well, there's two ways to think about it. It is a departure from the way federal agencies usually calculate benefits, but it is a global pollutant. So many of the benefits will occur outside the United States. So what do? So this is a way of thinking about it. If you're going to report both things, here's what you would do. You'd say, okay, well, and now you have to apply some dollar value to a ton of CO2, right? Or else you can't monetize this. So the administration uses what's called the social cost of carbon from this technical document. A bunch of agencies got together, and there's different values in that, and I think they take the midpoint value for these numbers here. So if all you cared about was climate benefits within the US, that would be about $3 billion a year. And then the costs would be $9 billion, okay? And so the net benefits would be negative, okay? If that's all you cared about. And I don't know where this, forget this last line, I don't know where that came from. Okay, then if you cared about global climate benefits, including the US, you get much bigger dollar values, right? Because you're accruing benefits abroad. And again, you got compliance costs of $9 billion. So now you've got net benefits of $22 billion. So there's a very big difference whether you do that internal benefit or global. Now, let's add the health stuff, okay? Now, in this case, this is fully consistent with the way we do federal rulemaking. If a federal agency writes a rule and say, we're gonna control this pollutant, and they make another pollutant worse, they have to report that, right? In this case, they're making another pollutant better, so it would be typical to report that. So these co-benefits are very large, and arguably, depending on which of the monetizations you use, are bigger than the climate benefits, and a lot bigger than the domestic climate benefits. In fact, you could justify this rule just based on the human health benefits, and this is within the US, by the way. This is just US benefits, okay? There's not a lot of non-US health benefits because these pollutants stay, these are benefits that accrue because Americans are not being exposed to these toxins or whatever pollutants they are. Okay, so then you go through that, and so the way you get the highest net benefits is by getting both the domestic and the international climate and health benefits. So now, if you don't like the rule, you're gonna just harp on this column. If you do like the rule, you're gonna tout that column. But these would be typical is to look at the domestic climate benefits and the domestic health benefits. If you do that, you're still looking at a pretty good rule. Okay, so now every state is given a standard, and every state standard is going to be different based on the calculations EPA does for the state. But then the states choose how to implement it. And there are a few issues, though. EPA lets them take, okay, so the standard that EPA sets, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, is not how many tons of carbon you can emit. See, that would make too much sense. It's just not how the Clean Air Act works. Instead, what EPA has said to states, you can emit, under this proposal, no more than X pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour that you generate. It's an emissions rate per unit of electricity. But then they say, okay, well, states, if you want to convert it to tons or pounds or whatever, fine. But now we don't know exactly how that conversion's going to work, and what happens if they do the conversion and they meet their mass-based target, but they haven't met the rate-based target. What happens? And so it's just giving more confusion to the states. But you have to have a mass-based standard if you have a cap and trade program, because you trade around a level of emissions, right, and not a rate of emission. So all those states that have a cap and trade program are going to have to figure out how to convert the EPA's rate into a mass and then use their policies. So already we have 10 states that have cap and trade. There's California, and then there's the regional greenhouse gas initiative states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. Now they're going to have to beef up that program in order to meet the EPA standards. So they're going to have to tighten it up. And then there's a bunch of states with other policies already in place, like renewable portfolio standards. You have one in Nevada, and other kinds of standards that are in place. And this is a little map showing different local governments and state governments. The dark blue means you've got some kind of mandatory program, like a renewable portfolio standard. And the little yellow dots are communities where the mayors have signed some pledge to reduce emissions. And you can see it, there's Nevada over there. And you actually do have some communities that have special commitments to climate change. And then this is the RPS. That means the standard of how much of your electricity has to be renewable. And Nevada has a fairly ambitious one where you're going to have 25% of your electricity renewable by 2025. And within that, you have to have a certain amount of solar. So that's fairly ambitious standard. So how does EPA do this? What are they doing? Well, they, like I said, they come up with a rate-based standard, and it affects these things called EGUs, electricity generating units, which are basically the part of the power plant that actually produces the emissions. And EPA went through and they constructed 4 building blocks for these targets. And based on kind of the 4 categories of things that states could do to lower emissions. And they decided that it had to be technically feasible. So what are the building blocks? The first is to improve what's called the heat rate at the coal plant, getting more electricity out for every ton of coal that you burn. That's the first building. So it's like energy efficiency, but within the power plant. Then the second one is to use your lower emitting plants more. In many cases, a state has more capacity to produce electricity from its natural gas-fired power plants than it actually uses. It's called your utilization rate. So EPA tries to do an estimate of how much more you could run those facilities, whether they're the natural gas ones or renewable facilities, maybe even hydropower. Could you get more power out of that? It goes in the formula. Then you can also build more low-emitting sources, right? More renewables, that's certainly an option. And then you could just use less electricity. You could, in economics, we'd call this demand destruction. This would be energy efficiency mandates of various kinds, or programs where the utility tries to get you to buy certain light bulbs or whatever. And there's a lot of those demand-side management programs around. So they do a calculation, and on the numerator you got your CO2 emissions from the regulated plants, and then on the denominator you got this complicated formula that's some of your generation but not all of your generation. And then they've got this thing, well, you got to have an estimated savings, because what do you do with savings? Because it's a rate of stuff that happens. What do you do about the stuff that doesn't happen? So this is it for a formula. This, to me, is a little easier to follow. There's the emissions, and then this adjusted computation of generation. And that's the thing that has to hit the state-based target. And you can go in and you can read the gory details. There's certain estimates of how much additional nuclear capacity that could go in there as well. Okay, so this is a little too wordy, sorry about that. So EPA has a goal, it gives it out to the states, and let's just assume for the sake of argument that the final rule looks more or less like the proposed rule, because it could change. When they finalize it, it could look a little different. Then the state has to meet some interim goals and a final goal. Now I've been talking about the rate reduction. That's what EPA specifies as the rate at 2030, okay? But then there's an implied emissions level reduction, and that's what this chart is. So Nevada is expected to reduce its emissions by 43% relative to 2012. That's the estimate of EPA about how much emissions would fall if the states meet their standard. So that's pretty high. California is actually already complying, so they don't necessarily have to do anything. As long as if they have new generation capacity that it doesn't, exceed their threshold, they're going to be fine. Other states have more ambitious than even Nevada. There's Arizona over there. Louisiana, 55%. Okay, so that is a very significant reduction in emissions.
Well, that's the highest. No.
What's that?
No, Mississippi's highest. Oh, no, Maine.
Washington.
Yeah, okay, let me explain about that, okay? So Washington has one coal plant, and it's scheduled for retirement already. So don't get too excited because they had very, very low emissions. So it doesn't take that much of an emissions reduction to be a big percentage of the existing total. You know what I mean? So Maine, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's a similar situation up in Maine. And then they've just taken it. And the thing is, some of these guys, they either have hydropower or they import it from Canada. And so they didn't need a lot of fossil fuels to begin with. Yeah.
And so North Dakota has to get worse?
No,
Oh,
plus 1%. So it suggests to me that, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on in Nevada, North Dakota. But again, this is relative to 2012. So the rate is calculated relative to 2005. So it could be that there were big changes between 2005 and 2012 that make these numbers significantly different than the difference in the rate reduction.
Oh, Missouri's the champ. Really?
Yeah. So, the thing about these charts is you can't help but be left scratching your head a little bit about what's really going on in these numbers and what's the deal with each of these states. If you map out the carbon intensity of the electricity sector, it is literally all over the map for the US. And so there's some states that are remember, nationally, 39% of the electricity is coal. And so locally, it's pretty concentrated. Okay. All right, so why are they different? So some of it is that the existing ratio of coal to natural gas, EPA takes that into account. And again, it's the existing, not what it was in 2005, how much they can expand that second building block of using more of their efficient units, emissions efficient units, et cetera. And they do this thing where they compare a state and its renewables to other states around it. And so if your state has less renewables than your comparison neighboring state, you're going to get a tighter target because the implication is, well, if they did it, you could do it too, right? So maybe you can and maybe you can't, but that's how EPA does the calculation. So let's go back to Nevada. So Nevada's emission rate in 2012 was 988 pounds per megawatt hour, and the proposed target is 647 pounds per megawatt hour. So that's a more than 34% rate reduction expected for Nevada. So it sounds pretty ambitious, doesn't it? Nevada has some advantages, though, which I'll describe. So in graphical terms, so this is that same graph you saw before, but just the natural gas and coal, because this is just electricity. So what we're saying is you're going to go from about those level emissions to right around there, okay, within some tolerance of PowerPoint as best I could do it, okay? Now, so that means you're either going to have to shrink the red or shrink the black or a combination of both. All right, and then where are those coal plants? According to this data, there's 3 of them. There's one right near here, Reed Gardner, and then there's this one over here, which I guess they count because it sells. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And then this one up here. Okay, so there's 3 coal plants selling into Nevada, and I saw different numbers and different data sources. So
there's a 4th in Eureka County that supplies a gold mine, and then there was another one that closed closed in 2005, which is a large part of that reduction in Laughlin.
Oh,
It's-
yeah.
It's now.
You mean the post 2005
Yeah,
drop off?
That was
Okay.
a 1,500 megawatt plant in Laughlin.
Ah, okay, okay, good. So now the Reed Gardner one is this one here. And according to this information, that's the biggest one. It's over half of the generating capacity of coal for Nevada. What?
Yeah, but that one's going.
Yeah, so that's my
Oh,
point.
Sorry, yeah, never mind.
Yeah, that's right where I'm going with that. Thank you so much for bringing that
Never
up.
mind, never mind, sorry.
So there it is, Reed Gardner, and NV Energy put in its plan that it's submitted to the regulators that's going to shut down that facility little by little, but 100% by 2017. So if you figure, you know, about half of that, or maybe more depending on which data you're looking at, is going to go away by 2017, this little white dashed thing doesn't look quite so scary in terms of ambition.
Volney's gone at the same time.
What's that?
Volney's gone at the same time.
Yeah, so I didn't see
I believe.
definitive
There.
information about the future of that plant.
NV's half. Oh,
Well, okay, so good question. So this says Reed Gardner's 557 megawatts and Valmy's 261, but I saw another data source that puts Valmy at a higher megawatt hour. So I don't know for
Well,
sure.
it's half and half Idaho Power and NV.
Okay,
Volney is half and half.
But
I
if you-
assume that's the-
I think it's fair to say that if you got rid of both of those, you're going a long, long way. And the other thing too is that EPA regulates plants by where they sit, okay? So Nevada has to regulate emissions where the smokestack resides in Nevada. So its target, I don't think, is affected by the emissions that are happening next door.
Well,
So
I guess.
now-
Yeah, but there's no state that regulates Navajo, right?
where is it?
Because it's on the reservation. They run
Oh,
it. Yeah, well, that was gonna be one of my questions.
I don't know
Never
the
mind.
answer to that. Like, who's got the jurisdiction of Indian
I've already
land?
asked about that, and they don't plan to cut it at all, as far as I know.
Well, that's interesting. That's a good point. I actually had never heard that conundrum. I don't know.
Yeah, when I drove into Lake Powell, to see Lake Powell, I could see the smoke falling into the water too, just the ash dribbling down on the water, so.
Well, it is a sovereign nation, so there are issues of
It
jurisdiction.
has to be the federal government.
Well, yeah, but what EPA's jurisdiction under the Clean Air Act is in Indian country, I don't know. And that's obviously a bigger deal out west than it might be elsewhere.
You're right.
So anyway, suffice it to say though, I think Nevada has a few advantages. Relatively little coal-fired generation as it sits now, and a projection to retire a bunch of that capacity in the near term anyhow, and an ambitious renewable portfolio standard that is likely to expand renewable generation anyway. So it's not obvious to me how much extra Nevada is going to have to do to meet the EPA standard. Okay. What's that?
I have a math minor, but I think they're gonna make it.
Yeah, it depends on demand growth and how much,
Well, and that
yeah.
Navajo factor, yeah.
Yeah,
that's very
so anyway, so they're gonna do their compliance plans, everybody has to do it. I live in Virginia. Virginia is really grappling with this because we have coal-fired generation in Virginia and it is not clear what to do. Now, here are some of the options. These were ones provided, I think, by EPA, and then I added that one. So some of these are policies, and some of these are more technical changes. It's not clear exactly how they might be induced by policies. But you can, like I said, you can do biomass, so you can do energy conservation, a whole bunch of different things. Now, if you wanted to induce all of this cost effectively, you would price carbon, and then the firms involved in this would figure it out for themselves, right? And so I've been working on EPA to get them to reassure states that if they priced carbon, that would suffice.
You'd have to have the clean energy, so you didn't put up cogeneration.
Well, that's you can either do cogen. You mean with biomass?
Well, anything.
Yeah, something lower carbon. Yeah, yeah, you can do it. Well,
Yeah.
basically, do you need a longer list? I mean, you can kind of do whatever you want as long as it lowers
Cogen is a good.
emissions, right? And the one nice thing for states is they have some time. So for those states that have coal-fired power plants that have an expected lifetime and they know those things are going to get retired, as long as they do it soon enough, they can emit a little over the trajectory as long as they're coming under it later on. But they have to end up at the end of the day below, in 2030 at that below that rate. Now they can get together and do it jointly, and there's a little flexibility there. But if states do it jointly, then they're going to be a little vulnerable if the neighboring states don't comply. So they're going to have to work out a pretty ironclad deal. And then EPA is going to review these rules, and states are going to have to show modeling projections that what they're doing is going to meet the EPA standards. And they have to show that we're going to monitor all the emissions, and we're going to report, and we're going to enforce everything, and so on. And the policies the state have to adopt have to be enforceable. They can't just say, oh, we're going to do a whole bunch of voluntary stuff, right? It has to be enforceable measures of some kind. So I talked a little bit about the benefits and costs. One of the things I didn't mention so far is, so you might be worried that all this moving around of emissions to renewables and stuff would raise electricity bills. Well, EPA says no, that's not true, because if states invest in energy efficiency, then electricity bills will go down, and they estimate the average decline would be 8% in electricity bills. Okay, but I would just say, yeah, you can drive your electricity bill down by paying money for other stuff that reduces your electricity. So don't be, I don't know, I find this just a tad bit misleading when they're focusing on electricity bills. Well, what about my credit card bill for the LED light bulb, right? Or whatever the other things I had to spend money on to get my electricity bill down. Well, somehow that didn't come out in this graph. EPA also rebuts the idea that this is a big war on coal, because they project that coal still will be a large share of generation nationally even after this rule. But environmentalists would say, well, that just means you didn't do a very good job protecting the environment. So there's a couple different ways you could interpret this. Okay, so then what happens? Okay, so right now, the proposed rules out there, there's comments. I'm not sure about the December 1st date, but I'm going to be supplying comments. And my comments are going to say, gosh, EPA, why don't you let states tax carbon as a way to comply with these rules? Because remember, this is just power plants. There's going to be other rules coming down that are going to be oil refineries and chemical plants and other industrial facilities and so on. And they're going to have a different rule for each source category. And they're going to have different rates for different states for different source categories. So it already doesn't, I mean, you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be horrible. So even states that are already compliant with the power plant standards might face burdens as far as oil refineries or something else goes. So my argument to states is they need to think ahead when they put their strategies together for complying with the EPA rule. They should think, well, what's an easy way to make that policy extendable to these other sources when EPA gets around to them? My view is an excise tax on carbon is a perfect way to do it. You can start with the carbon in the power plants and add the tax as it goes on. If you do cap and trade system, you can't use the same cap and trade system for power plants as you do for oil refineries because it has to meet a different standard, right? And the allowances wouldn't be fungible because you might over-comply with power plants, but that doesn't let you under-comply with oil refineries. So under the EPA rule, there's no good way to sort of shift emissions around in anything that looks like a cost-effective way. You might be able to do it regionally or across states within a source category, but you can't do it across source categories. So I wanted to tout a bill I helped work on. I was talking to Representative Delaney from Maryland about the design of a federal carbon tax. And I said, I'm leaning on EPA. I want EPA to let states tax carbon as a way to comply. And he liked the idea and wrote a bill that would require EPA to allow states to tax carbon as a way to comply. And in fact, it would substitute a price requirement for states that chose. It doesn't require states to do anything. But for states that chose, they could adopt the tax and then not worry about the standards I was just talking about and what all that other stuff with the rates and mass and all that. They could just adopt a price signal. And so they specified $20 per ton starting in 2015. And they also said that standard would apply not just to power plants, but all the other source categories I was talking about. So if states wanted to, they could just adopt one simple excise tax across all the stationary sources and be done with EPA rules forever. And so my advice to Republicans is take it. And if you don't like $20 a ton, negotiate around that. But it's a perfect way to cap the compliance costs for the states. And just let states price carbon, haggle over the price if you will, but then you don't have long litigation and all this regulatory uncertainty, and states could just adopt one law and be done with. And I think that would be in everybody's interest, environmental and economic. So you can see that at the website. So I'm going to close. I see at my time, but I'm going to close there, and I'm going to welcome questions.
How does that tax bring down emissions?
Well, several ways. Okay, let me go back to that big giant list. Right? So all of these activities become more cost effective and attractive if you're charged based on the carbon content of your fuel, right? So if you think about it, coal has more emissions per energy than natural gas, and renewables doesn't have any. So when you tax carbon, you change the relative price of all those different ways to generate electricity, and you do it in perfect resonance with the environmental damages. So all you have to do is price carbon, and then everybody does all of these things if they're cost effective at the tax rate. And so when EPA does its analysis of how much abatement it's going to get, it does a bunch of calculations. The way they do that is they put a price on carbon in the model and they watch what happens. And they can see all the different emissions reduction strategies that are taken up, projected in the model. Yeah?
Me?
Sure.
Well, it was interesting. I'm going to have to go through that number chart of yours. That was fascinating. But and I know you had, for example, Wyoming has the 31, needs to go down 31%, not as bad as Nevada. That's fascinating to me because they're 85% coal. So it seems to me, compared to us here in Nevada, where we already really have a plan in place, it seems like they would have a lot more work to do. And Utah's was even lower yet at 21%, and I know they're 55% coal.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna have to, Utah's 55% coal.
Well, I didn't do
Wyoming's
these, just to be clear, I did
85%.
not do these numbers. These
Oh, okay.
came from the EPA modeling.
Oh,
So
you-
you can go into,
okay,
if you
I'll
go
have to ask
into the
EPA.
EPA website, and I stole this chart from another presentation, so, but if you go into the clean, it's called the Clean Power Plan, and you can go in there and dig in on how they calculated every state's numbers.
In addition to the tax, though, don't you really need mandates? I mean, don't you really need, and again, that's sort of like my plan, a tax could sort of be, I mean, again, if you're very wealthy per capita in Wyoming, you just say, well, all right, so we'll pay the tax. So I guess, don't you need also, I guess that, I know you and I've talked a little about that, but I think that I just kind of like to
I
have
think
some
it's entirely
mandates in
possible
there.
that there's different demand elasticities in different states for
Yeah.
electricity. So it could be you raise the price of electricity 5% in one state, you get a different percentage
It'd be
reduction
interesting
in
to-
different states. Now, but the thing is, when you tax carbon, you're incentivizing stuff that's not even at the retail level. You're incentivizing the fuel switching. You're incentivizing the solar deployment. If it's cost effective, and if a certain tax rate doesn't get you the emissions abatement you want, you haven't set your tax rate right? Adding mandates, what you're doing is you're driving abatement in a particular direction that you've determined by fiat. And it may or may not be the lowest cost way to do it. This is kind of engaging the invisible hand and inducing market reactions. And the evidence strongly suggests that if you give these pervasive market signals, particularly over time, people, firms, technologies respond. And I would also say that if you don't price carbon, you're certainly not incentivizing new technologies. Because if you have a technology standard based on current technologies, you're going to get current technologies. What you want to do is create a market for new technologies and new methods and so on. And so there's both the static efficiency and the dynamic efficiency that you care about, particularly for a problem like this where we are facing a multiple generation problem. I mean, if we're really going to stabilize concentrations, we have to decarbonize the economy, which is, think about the new technologies we're going to need.
No, that's a good-
Yeah.
Well, first I want to thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. It's a pleasure to come to these Brookings lectures and to be stimulated and excited about ideas. It's awfully disappointing not to see classes of students here to listen to this kind of information that's so important to our future. It's very disappointing to me. Couple of questions.
Sure.
With regard to the Nevada chart that you had up and what we needed to do, don't we need to just turn off everything and essentially buy our electricity from California?
Well, so I think that what you want to do, okay, I'm going to phrase it in what would likely be cost effective. Okay, electricity prices are really high in California. In fact, in Nevada, electricity prices are a little bit below national averages. And so you don't really want to mess with that if you can help it. So what you want to do is undertake the abatement of emissions where it's absolutely cheapest to do that. So in places like Nevada, where you have aging coal plants, yes, I know there's been technological improvements in Reed Gardner since it was built in the 60s, but I mean, there is a natural life to some of these plants, and if you can retire them and replace them cost effectively, that could be a really low cost way to do it. You're gonna have to talk to a grid expert about whether it makes sense to import electricity from California. My sense is that most of the electricity is going the other way. Go ahead, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank the gentleman for.
Oh yeah, I should have started with thank you very much for your kind feedback.
And just a little perspective on the latter point, which is that faculty, and I speak from personal experience here, you can't require students to attend things outside of, the class hours. You can incentivize them in some
That's
cases.
why God created extra credit.
Yes, and so that on the different given lectures, we do have classes, sometimes multiple classes here. But one of the things we do is record these lectures and get them up on the website, so faculty can then actually assign the lectures to the classes, even though they're not sitting here. And I need to thank all our Greenspun College colleagues who help us do that. So thank you again.
So are we out of time at this juncture?
No, we can take a couple more.
Oh yeah, please do.
One question with regard to pricing carbon.
Yeah.
I thought that's a very interesting, and your enthusiasm about it, I don't necessarily share, but I'm interested with regard to taxes, because taxes are ultimately passed on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the Al Gores of this world that have to worry about them. It's the taxes that people who are less well off, that they're passed on to, that have to worry about them. How do you see this tax impacting on individuals that are not well off?
I know exactly what you're asking, and that's a core area of my research. So when you impose an excise tax on carbon, and that's what this would be, it is absolutely true that that price signal gets passed through the whole energy supply system and eventually to other goods and services that use energy, right, in their supply chain. But there's a lot of good news. Number one, throughout all that process, you're incentivizing abatement at every level of the use of energy. And when the tax is collected by the government, it doesn't disappear. It's revenue that the government can use to reduce other taxes. And our research suggests that if you use the revenue from a pollution tax, like a carbon tax, to reduce other taxes on things you value, like working and saving and investing, depending on how you do it, you can actually have first of all, you greatly reduce the economic burden of the carbon tax, because while you're adding one burden, you're taking other burdens away. And if you use the revenue to reduce the most distortionary taxes, particularly ones that discourage investment, you can even get a pro-growth net benefit. So it can be on net good for the economy, even independent of the emissions abatement. Now you have to do it exactly right to get that result. Now you raise another really good point though, is that poor households they spend more as a share of their income on energy than rich households. We would call that a regressive tax. But there are really good ways to deal with that in how you use the revenue as well. I mean, you can use the revenue to support your social safety net programs. You can use the revenue to reduce other taxes that are borne by lower income and working families. And so there's so finding the sweet spot between optimizing the macroeconomic effects of the tax and ensuring that those who can't afford the burden of that tax are protected that's the core of my research right now. And how could you do it at the federal level, and how could you do it at the state level? But I think it's very doable. And remember, you're using that tax to replace the regulations that I've just been describing and their ilk of all the other regulations that are going to be coming forward, and all the subsidies and other things that are trying to get to the same environmental endpoints. So you can rationalize all that at the same time you're potentially doing a pro-growth tax reform. In the back.
Does the EPA plan on
making regulations for the switch to natural gas and the harvesting of natural gas and fracking and all the pollutants that come from that, or?
That's a good question. So there are greenhouse gas. So what you're alluding to is what's called the life cycle emissions. So if you use natural gas for power plants, well, the question is, what were their greenhouse gas emissions in the production of that natural gas, or in the production of the coal, or in the production of the solar panels, for that matter, right? So the question arises, if you're going to try to boost the demand for natural gas, are you creating some offsetting environmental damage elsewhere in the system? Now those offsetting emissions, if they do occur, would not fall under this regulation, but it could well fall under other regulations. For example, what they call green completion rules around natural gas wells, where they monitor the emissions and they require like hardening of the cement cores of these wells in a certain way and so on. So obviously it doesn't make sense to, it's like whack-a-mole. You don't want to whack the mole here and have the head pop up over there. So they're going to have to stay on top of that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, not so much in regards to emissions, but at least in regards to hydraulic fracking, it was my understanding that they do not fall under the Clean Water Act, and that they don't have to be monitored in like the chemicals that they put in the water and then where they dispose of them. So would it not so much in emissions, but in the pollution in that sense?
So you're right. So there might be local pollutant implications of expanding the natural gas market. And it is true that, so the question is, are there sufficient regulations around the natural gas or oil? I mean, they do fracking for oil in the oil shales as well. And what's happening with water quality on that. I think that my understanding is a lot of that regulation will be happening at the state level. And so states are going to have to regulate what happens to the fracking fluids and how are those, what are the requirements on how those liquids are being transported and stored and so on. Yeah. Let's make this the last question.
Oh, okay, or we can talk about it offline. But, well, and to follow up on that, in advocating for the natural gas use, I strongly urge they use free-flowing. It's interesting you mentioned the cross, because most of the natural gas, we expel and flare more natural gas than we're getting from fracking. If we just put an end to flaring and captured it, most of the fracking is, many of the Bakken Shale, for example, it's all to extract the petroleum, and they couldn't care less about the natural gas. In fact, it's an irritant. They burn it.
Well, it's not that they don't care about it, it's that it's not cost effective to recover it, right? Because if you're not part of a distribution system, it's not costless to go out there with a truck and gather all that stuff. But to that, I would say, further reason we have to price carbon.
I think
because the flaring would be part of the tax base, right? Because you're burning carbon, right? And that would give firms a bigger financial incentive to recover that natural gas. And without a price on carbon, you're not going to get that.
Well, and they can also redirect any of the proceeds from that can be redirected.
Well, like I described, you can use it for.
So we can continue this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we wrap up here?
I do. I want to be sensitive and try and get people out on time who are kind enough to come. So Adele will be around if you have an unasked question or something you'd like to follow up on. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
As you recall, we debated one of the topics we thought we might have you talk about this time was fracking, so maybe we need to revisit that topic for a future lecture. Come and join us next week if you can. We'll have a colleague, Mark Moreau, out, and Mark's taking a look at the sort of, to put this in layman's terms, the high technology industries and how they are looking for employees, what skills they want and need, where Nevada sits in that chain, what Nevada is doing right, and what it needs to do. So it will be an economic look and an employment look at our state and the country in the high-tech sector. So I hope if you have time, please come back next Wednesday and join us. Thanks again.
Thank you.